January 17, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets across the frozen prairie. The wind howled through the barbed wire fences, carrying with it the bitter cold of a Midwestern winter that cut through wool and flesh alike. Inside Compound 7, a group of Japanese prisoners of war stood in formation outside a newly constructed wooden building, unremarkable except for the words painted above its entrance in both English and Japanese, Library, Toshokan. Lieutenant Takashi Yamamoto, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Army's 32nd Division, stared at those characters with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and suspicion. His hands, chapped and raw from weeks of labor in the camp's furniture workshop, trembled not from cold but from something he could not name. Behind him, 43 men stood equally silent, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. They had been told to assemble here by the American camp administration. They had been told nothing more. The door opened. An American soldier, no older than 23, gestured for them to enter. No shouts, no rifle butts prodding backs. Just a simple motion of invitation. Yamamoto stepped across the threshold, and the world he understood, the world he had been taught to understand, began to fracture. The room was warm. That was the first shock. Heat radiated from cast-iron radiators along the walls, a luxury the prisoners had not known since their capture. But it was not the warmth that made Yamamoto stop so abruptly that the man behind him nearly collided with his back. It was the shelves. Row upon row of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of them. Perhaps thousands. Their spines created a mosaic of colors: burgundy, forest green, navy blue, tan leather. Japanese characters marked many of them. Not propaganda. Not military manuals. Novels. Poetry. Philosophy. History. He saw the works of Natsume Soseki, the poetry of Matsuo Basho, even Western literature translated into Japanese, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Dickens. Are we allowed this? The whisper came from Private Hiroshi Tanaka, a 20-year-old farmer's son from Kagoshima who had been conscripted in 1943. His voice carried the tremor of a man confronting something that contradicted every truth he had been raised to believe. The question hung in the warm air like smoke. To understand why this moment shattered these men, one must first understand what they had been taught to expect. From the moment Japanese soldiers entered military service, they were indoctrinated with the principles of the Senjinkan, the military code distributed to all servicemen in 1941. Its fifth principle stated explicitly, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken prisoner alive." Death was preferable to capture. Surrender was not merely defeat, it was spiritual annihilation, a stain upon one's family that would persist for generations. More than this, Japanese soldiers had been systematically taught that their enemies were barbarians. American and British forces, they were told, tortured prisoners before executing them. Propaganda films shown in training camps depicted Allied soldiers as savage, subhuman creatures who delighted in cruelty. Captured Japanese soldiers, the narrative went, would be subjected to unspeakable torments: mutilation, starvation, psychological torment designed to break the spirit before destroying the body. This was not presented as possibility but as certainty. Officers reinforced these beliefs through lectures and written materials. Surrender was not only dishonorable, it was suicidal. Better to die by one's own grenade than fall into enemy hands. Takashi Yamamoto had believed this absolutely. When his unit was overrun during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944, he had clutched a Type 97 hand grenade, his thumb hovering over the pin. He had been prepared to die. He had wanted to die. The explosion would have been instant, perhaps painful, but brief, and infinitely preferable to what awaited him in American captivity. But in the chaos of battle, in the smoke and screaming, a concussion grenade had detonated near him. He had woken hours later with his ears ringing and his vision swimming, his hands zip-tied behind his back, American medics checking his pupils and feeling his skull for fractures. He had failed even to die properly. The journey to the prisoner of war camp had been a descent he anticipated would end in horror. First, the field hospital where, to his confusion, American doctors had treated his concussion and the shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and leg. Then the transport ship to Hawaii, where he and hundreds of other prisoners had been held in temporary camps. Then the final journey to the American mainland, to Wisconsin, a state whose name he could barely pronounce, in a country he had been trained to see as the dwelling place of demons. He had waited for the torture to begin. He had steeled himself for starvation, for beatings, for the systematic destruction of everything that made him human. Instead, he had been given 3 meals a day, a bunk with a mattress and blankets, medical care when a wound infection flared in his leg, work assignments in the furniture shop where prisoners built chairs and tables, for which they received small wages in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen to purchase cigarettes, candy, and personal items. It made no sense. It violated everything he understood about the natural order of war. And now this, a library. Yamamoto moved deeper into the room as if walking through water. His fingers traced the spine of a volume, Kokoro by Natsume Soseki, a novel he had read as a student before the war consumed everything. He pulled it from the shelf. The book was real, solid. The pages were crisp, unmarked. Someone had purchased this book, shipped it across an ocean, and placed it here for him to read. Why? The question escaped his lips in Japanese, directed at no one in particular. The American soldier who had opened the door, Corporal James McKinley from Iowa, though Yamamoto did not know his name, seemed to understand the tone if not the words. He spoke slowly, and a bilingual Japanese-American interpreter who had entered behind them translated. The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners of war be treated humanely. That includes access to educational and recreational materials. This library is part of that requirement. You may borrow books. You may sit and read here during non-work hours. There is no limit to how many books you can take. The interpreter's words fell like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that spread outward. No limit. Private Tanaka moved to a shelf containing books in English. He could read only basic English, enough to recognize titles. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Moby Dick, The Grapes of Wrath. Beside them, English-language magazines, Life, National Geographic, Popular Mechanics. Not current issues, certainly, they were months or years old, but publications that showed American life, American technology, American society. "This is a trick," Sergeant Kenji Kobayashi muttered. He was older than most of the prisoners, 34, a career soldier who had fought in China before the Pacific War began. "They want to soften us, make us weak, make us forget who we are." But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed him. They kept drifting to the shelves, to the impossible abundance of knowledge freely offered. The library at Camp McCoy was not unique. By 1945, prisoner of war camps across the United States had implemented educational programs as part of a broader policy that baffled and disturbed many captured Axis soldiers. The policy was rooted partly in international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established guidelines for prisoner treatment, but it went beyond legal requirements into something more ambitious and more threatening to totalitarian worldviews: the American conviction that information and education were not privileges to be rationed but rights to be distributed. Camp administrators compiled library collections specifically tailored to their prisoner populations. For Japanese POWs, this meant acquiring Japanese language books through publishers in Japan before the war, through neutral countries during the conflict, and through Japanese-American communities willing to donate materials. The collections included classical literature, contemporary novels, poetry, religious texts, scientific works, and even Japanese-language newspapers published in the United States. The scale was staggering. By 1945, major POW camps housing Japanese prisoners maintained libraries of between 2,000 and 5,000 volumes. Camp McCoy's library, considered mid-sized, held approximately 3,200 books, of which roughly 1,100 were in Japanese. For context, the average Japanese soldier came from a society where books were precious commodities. Paper shortages during the war had made new publications increasingly rare. Military libraries, when they existed at all, consisted primarily of technical manuals and ideological texts. Personal book ownership was uncommon among working-class and rural families, the demographics from which most enlisted soldiers were drawn. Now, in captivity, these men had access to more books than many had seen in their entire lives. Yamamoto did not borrow a book that first day. He could not bring himself to believe the offer was genuine. Instead, he walked slowly through the rows, reading titles, occasionally pulling a volume from the shelf to verify its reality before replacing it. Around him, other prisoners did the same, moving in near silence, each man conducting his own private confrontation with cognitive dissonance. The warmth of the room seeped into his bones. Through the windows, he could see snow continuing to fall, blanketing the compound in white. The radiators ticked and hissed. Somewhere in the building, someone was typing, the steady percussion of keys striking paper. It was the most peaceful place Yamamoto had been since the war began. That night, lying on his bunk, he stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he had seen with what he had been taught. The Americans were supposed to be materialistic barbarians, devoted only to profit and personal pleasure, incapable of understanding concepts like duty, honor, or sacrifice. They were supposed to be weak, decadent, corrupted by democracy's chaos. Yet they had built libraries for their prisoners. They had heated those libraries. They had filled them with books, not just in English but in Japanese, the language of the enemy. They had invited captured soldiers to read, to learn, to think. Why? The question gnawed at him through the night. Over the following weeks, the library became the center of an invisible transformation rippling through Compound 7. Men who had initially resisted its existence, viewing it as a psychological trap or an affront to military discipline, began to drift through its doors. At first, they went in pairs or small groups, as if seeking safety in numbers. They would spend 15 minutes browsing, then leave quickly, looking over their shoulders as if expecting punishment for some undefined transgression. But gradually, the visits lengthened. Men began borrowing books, signing them out through the American librarian and his Japanese-American assistant. They would carry the volumes back to their barracks tucked under their arms, handling them with a reverence reserved for sacred objects. Private Tanaka borrowed a collection of haiku poetry. He had written poetry before the war, simple verses about his village, the rice paddies, the mountains visible from his family's farm. The war had silenced that part of him. Now, reading Basho's journey poems, something long dormant stirred. He began writing again, scratching verses onto scraps of paper during his lunch breaks. Sergeant Kobayashi, who had declared the library a trick, checked out a book on American history. He read about the Revolutionary War, about a collection of colonies defeating the most powerful empire on earth. He read about the Civil War, about a nation tearing itself apart over questions of human freedom and stitching itself back together. The narrative did not match what he had been taught. Americans were supposed to be shallow, without genuine convictions. Yet their history was written in blood spilled over principles. Yamamoto finally borrowed Kokoro. He read it slowly, savoring each page. The novel's exploration of loneliness, guilt, and the weight of the past resonated in ways it had not when he first read it as a student. Then, it had been merely a story. Now, it was a mirror. The library's impact extended beyond individual reading. It became a social space, one of the few areas where prisoners could gather outside of work details and meals. Men who had been strangers, soldiers from different units, different islands, different battles, found common ground among the shelves. They discussed books. They argued over interpretations of poems. They shared memories of Japan, of lives suspended by war. A book club formed, organized by the prisoners themselves. Every Tuesday evening, 12 to 15 men would gather in the library to discuss a selected work. The first book they chose was No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, a dark exploration of alienation and the search for identity. The discussion lasted 2 hours. Men who had not spoken about their feelings since their capture, who had been trained to view such expression as weakness, found themselves talking about shame, about disconnection from society, about the gap between the self they projected and the self they felt themselves to be. He picked up a translated copy of the Federalist Papers. The prose was dense, the arguments complex. He carried it to one of the reading tables and began to work through the first essay. The language of checks and balances, of distributed power, of government designed to function through tension rather than unity, it was alien to everything he understood about effective governance. But as he read, a thought occurred to him. The library itself was a small-scale demonstration of these principles. Prisoners were given access to information and trusted to use it responsibly. There were rules. Books had to be returned, materials had to be treated with care, but within those structures there was freedom, choice, individual agency. No one told him what to read. No one restricted his access to certain books because they might contain dangerous ideas. The entire collection was available to him, and the assumption was that he could engage with ideas without being corrupted or controlled by them. This was the American wager, that human beings, given information and freedom, would make reasonable choices. It was a wager that Japanese military ideology rejected absolutely. The average soldier, in the Japanese system, could not be trusted with freedom. He had to be directed, controlled, indoctrinated, and constantly supervised. Yet here, the wager seemed to be paying off. The library had not created chaos. It had created community. It had given men who had lost everything, their freedom, their homeland, their identity as soldiers, a means of rebuilding something internal that the war had damaged. By spring, the transformation was evident in subtle but measurable ways. Camp administrators noted that disciplinary incidents among prisoners with regular library access were significantly lower than among those who avoided it. Men who read were calmer, more cooperative, more willing to engage with camp programs. They were also more willing to consider that their pre-war understanding of America might have been incomplete. This was precisely what some American officials hoped would happen. The library program was part of a broader re-education effort, though the term was not used officially. The goal was not crude propaganda but something more sophisticated, exposing captured Axis soldiers to information and perspectives that contradicted their totalitarian conditioning, then allowing cognitive dissonance to do its work. Some prisoners resisted strenuously. They saw the library as a threat to their identity as Japanese soldiers. To accept its gifts would be to betray their comrades still fighting, to dishonor the memory of those who had died. These men avoided the library entirely or entered it only under direct order, refusing to borrow books or participate in discussions. But they were increasingly the minority. Most prisoners, confronted daily with evidence that their enemies were not the monsters they had been promised, began the slow, painful process of reconsidering their assumptions. One evening in April, the book club discussed a translated copy of Walden by Henry David Thoreau. The concept of a man voluntarily simplifying his life, rejecting material abundance to live deliberately by a pond in the woods, fascinated and confused the prisoners in equal measure. He had everything America offers, Private Tanaka said, struggling to articulate his confusion. He could have had comfort, wealth, security. And he chose to live like a monk. Why? The question sparked an hour of debate. Some men argued Thoreau was admirable, that his choice reflected a spiritual depth unexpected in an American. Others saw it as proof of American decadence. Only in a society drowning in excess could someone romanticize poverty. Yamamoto listened more than he spoke. What struck him was not Thoreau's choice, but the fact that he had been allowed to make it and then write about it. In Japan, such eccentricity would have been suppressed or channeled into acceptable forms. The individual's desires were subordinate to societal needs. But America had let Thoreau build his cabin, live his experiment, and publish his thoughts for anyone to read. And now those thoughts were available in a prison camp library in Wisconsin, translated into Japanese for enemy soldiers to discuss. The symbolism was inescapable. Not all the books in the library were philosophical or literary. There were technical manuals, engineering texts, agricultural guides. Some prisoners, looking ahead to a future beyond captivity, began studying practical skills. They read about American farming techniques, about industrial processes, about scientific developments. This created another form of cognitive dissonance. Japanese propaganda had consistently portrayed America as militarily and technologically inferior, a nation of soft, luxury-addicted people who would crumble when confronted by Japanese discipline and spirit. Yet the books revealed a society of extraordinary technical sophistication. The engineering manuals described manufacturing processes of stunning complexity. The agricultural texts discussed mechanized farming on a scale unimaginable in Japan. The scientific journals documented research in chemistry, physics, and medicine that was years ahead of Japanese equivalents. How could a weak, decadent nation produce this? The question had no comfortable answer within the framework these men had been given. Sergeant Kobayashi, reading a text on American industrial production, came across statistics that made him stop and reread the passage 3 times. In 1944 alone, American factories had produced nearly 100,000 aircraft. Tanks, ships, weapons, ammunition, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. Japan's entire industrial capacity in the same period was a fraction of this output. He had been taught that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages. But the gap was not one that spirit could bridge. It was a chasm. If the books were to be believed, and why would American prisoners of war libraries contain false statistics? Then Japan had been fighting an unwinnable war from the beginning. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the industrial foundations of American power were so vastly superior that no amount of Bushido could compensate. This thought was devastating. It meant that every death, every sacrifice, every brutal campaign across the Pacific had been for nothing. Not lost because Japan fought poorly, but doomed from the start by leaders who had either not understood the disparity or had understood and sent men to die anyway. The books became a refuge and a torment. They offered escape from the monotony of camp life, but they also forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths. The library was warm, quiet, and safe. Everything war was not. Yet within its walls, ideological certainties dissolved like snow in spring rain. Yamamoto found himself returning most frequently to poetry. The precision of haiku, the way 17 syllables could contain an entire world, offered solace. He began writing again, something he had not done since leaving for military service. Barbed wire stretches. Beyond it, snow-covered fields. I am here. I am here. The repetition in the final line was unconventional, but it captured something he could not express otherwise. The strangeness of existence. The dislocation of being alive when he should have died, of being treated humanely when he expected torture, of having access to books when he anticipated starvation. He showed the poem to Private Tanaka, who had become something of a confidant. Tanaka read it slowly, then nodded. "It's like we died on Saipan," Tanaka said quietly, "and this is the afterlife. But we don't know if it's punishment or reward." By summer, the war in Europe had ended. News filtered into the camp through official announcements and through newspapers available in the library. Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich was no more. Italy had already fallen. Japan stood alone. The prisoners absorbed this information with a mix of fear and resignation. Some argued that Japan would fight more fiercely now, that the spirit of the people would compensate for being surrounded. Others recognized the trajectory. The war was lost. It was only a question of how much more destruction would occur before the end came. In the library, discussions took on a new tone. Men began talking openly about what would come after. Could they return to Japan? Would they be executed as traitors for having surrendered? What would become of a Japan defeated, occupied, forced to submit to American authority? And beneath these practical questions ran deeper currents. What did they believe now? After months of reading, thinking, and discussing in this strange sanctuary, what remained of their old convictions? Yamamoto could not answer this for the others. He could barely answer it for himself. He knew that he was not the same man who had been captured on Saipan. That man had been certain. That man had known his place in the world, his duty, his identity. This man, the one who spent his evenings reading poetry and philosophy in a heated library in Wisconsin, was uncertain. Uncertain, but perhaps more honest. The old certainties had been comfortable, but they had also been brittle. They had shattered on contact with reality. The new uncertainty was uncomfortable, but it was also flexible. It could bend without breaking. It could accommodate complexity. August brought news that eclipsed all previous revelations. On the 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. On the 9th, another fell on Nagasaki. On the 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender via radio broadcast. The war was over. The prisoners of Camp McCoy learned of this through official channels. An assembly was called. The camp commander, through interpreters, explained that hostilities had ceased, that Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, that the prisoners would eventually be repatriated. The reactions were varied and complex. Some men wept with relief. Others sat in stunned silence. A few raged, insisting it was American propaganda, that Japan would never surrender, that the emperor would never submit. But most felt something harder to articulate, a sense of ending and beginning intertwined, grief mixed with liberation. That evening, the library was full. Men came not necessarily to read, but simply to be in a space that had become associated with contemplation and community. They sat at tables, stood by windows, leaned against shelves. Some held books without opening them. Others read the same page over and over without absorbing the words. Yamamoto sat with Kokoro open in his lap, but he was not reading. He was thinking about a passage near the end where the protagonist writes, "I wish to show him how a man of my kind could act like a true human being." The context was different, but the sentiment resonated. What did it mean to act like a true human being? What did it mean to have honor in a world where all the old definitions had proven inadequate? He thought about the library, this strange gift from a former enemy. No one had tortured him. No one had starved him. Instead, they had given him books. They had heated a room in winter and filled it with knowledge and invited him to partake. Why? He finally understood. Not because it was in their strategic interest, though perhaps it was. Not because they were soft or weak, though he had been taught to believe this. They did it because their system, chaotic, democratic, seemingly inefficient, was built on a foundational assumption that even enemies were human beings deserving of dignity. It was not sentiment. It was structural. Democracy's logic led to libraries, even for prisoners of war, because democracy insisted on the worth of the individual, on the value of education, on the belief that human beings given knowledge and choice would ultimately choose reason over fanaticism. It was a belief Japan's military ideology had rejected as naive. But here, in this library in Wisconsin, it had proven more powerful than barbed wire or guard towers. The months following the surrender were a time of limbo. Repatriation was a slow process. Paperwork had to be processed. Ships had to be arranged. The machinery of military bureaucracy ground forward at its characteristic pace. The prisoners remained in Camp McCoy through the fall and into the winter of 1945–46. During this time, the library continued to function. If anything, it became more central to daily life. With work assignments reduced and the future uncertain, men had time, vast expanses of it, to fill. Reading helped. Discussions helped. The slow, quiet work of rebuilding internal worlds dismantled by war helped. Some prisoners began learning English more seriously, preparing for a future in which knowing the victor's language might prove valuable. The library's English language section saw increased use. Men worked through basic texts, moved on to novels, struggled with idioms and cultural references. Others studied American government and history with new intensity. If Japan was to be occupied and reformed, understanding the occupier's values seemed prudent. Books on the Constitution, on American political philosophy, on the history of democratic movements were borrowed and read carefully. The prisoners were, without quite realizing it, engaging in their own re-education, not because they were forced to, but because they recognized its necessity. The world had changed. They had to change with it or be left behind. In February 1946, Yamamoto received word that he would be on one of the first ships returning to Japan. The news brought a complicated mix of emotions: joy at the prospect of going home, anxiety about what he would find there, and unexpected sadness at leaving the camp that had been his home for a year and a half. He returned to the library one final time. It was afternoon, the winter sun angling through windows and casting long shadows across the floor. A handful of other prisoners were scattered through the room, reading or simply sitting in the warmth. He walked to the shelf where Kokoro resided and pulled it out one last time. He had read it 3 times during his captivity. Each reading had revealed new layers, new resonances. He opened it to a passage he had marked in memory, near the beginning. My heart, which up to that moment had been so unsettled, gradually found peace. He had not found peace, exactly. But he had found something. A new framework for understanding himself and the world. An acceptance that certainty was less valuable than curiosity, that questions were often more honest than answers. He replaced the book carefully, letting his hand rest on its spine for a moment in something like benediction. On his way out, he stopped at the circulation desk. The American librarian, a middle-aged man from Milwaukee who had treated the prisoners with consistent courtesy, looked up. "Thank you," Yamamoto said in English, one of the few phrases he had mastered. The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. The librarian smiled and nodded. "Good luck," he replied. The ship that carried Yamamoto and several hundred other repatriated prisoners back to Japan departed from California in March 1946. The journey took 2 weeks across a Pacific Ocean that had so recently been a battlefield. Many of the men spent the voyage on deck, watching the horizon, wondering what awaited them. Japan, they knew from newspapers and letters, had been devastated. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ruins. Tokyo had been firebombed into ash. American occupation forces controlled the country. The emperor had renounced his divinity. The entire political structure was being dismantled and rebuilt along democratic lines. They were returning not to the nation they had left, but to something new and uncertain. Yamamoto spent much of the voyage reading. He had been permitted to keep 3 books as personal possessions. He had chosen Kokoro, a collection of Basho-s haiku, and on impulse he did not fully understand, a translated copy of Walden. These texts were his connection to the library, to the transformation he had undergone, to the proof that the enemy he had been taught to hate had instead offered him something like salvation. The American occupation of Japan brought many changes, but perhaps none more symbolically significant than the introduction of public libraries. Before the war, libraries in Japan had been limited, primarily serving universities and research institutions. Public access to books was restricted. Knowledge was controlled. The occupation authorities, implementing democratic reforms, established public libraries across the country. They were built on the American model: free access, open stacks, borrowing privileges for all citizens. The goal was the same as it had been in the POW camps, to demonstrate that democracy meant the free exchange of ideas, that knowledge was not a privilege hoarded by elites but a right distributed to all. Former POWs like Yamamoto, returning to find their country transformed, recognized the libraries immediately. They had seen this before. They had experienced firsthand what such institutions represented. Many of these men became advocates for the new Japan. Having confronted the flaws in the old ideology, having experienced an alternative in captivity, they were positioned to help rebuild. Some became teachers, carrying forward what they had learned. Others entered politics or business, working to create a Japan that could integrate traditional values with democratic principles. They were not uncritical of America. The nuclear bombings, the firebombing campaigns, the brutality of war, these could not be forgotten or excused. But they had learned to hold complexity, to recognize that nations and systems could be simultaneously flawed and admirable, destructive and constructive. The library in Camp McCoy had taught them this, though it had not intended to. It had simply been there, warm and open, filled with books, an embodiment of values that transcended propaganda. Yamamoto lived until 1987. He became a teacher after the war, educating children in the new Japan, a Japan that had renounced militarism and embraced peace. He never spoke much about his war service, but he spoke often about books, about the importance of reading, about the necessity of questioning and thinking. In his later years, he would sometimes tell his students about a library in Wisconsin. He would describe the snow falling outside the windows, the warmth of the radiators, the shelves filled with Japanese and English books. He would tell them about the cognitive dissonance of finding humanity where he had been taught to expect barbarism. "They gave us libraries," he would say, his voice still touched with wonder decades after the fact. "We were their prisoners, their enemies, and they gave us libraries." What kind of people do that? The question was rhetorical, but it had an answer, one that had taken him months to understand and a lifetime to fully appreciate. People who believed that even enemies could be taught, that even hatred could be dissolved through knowledge, that democracy's strength lay not in its armies or economies, but in its foundational insistence that all human beings possessed worth and potential. It was a radical belief. It was an expensive belief. It was, by the standards of efficient military occupation, an impractical belief. But it was also the belief that won the peace. The library at Camp McCoy was dismantled in 1946 after the last prisoners were repatriated. The books were distributed to public libraries across Wisconsin. The building was repurposed for other uses, then eventually torn down. No physical trace remains of the space where Japanese soldiers read poetry and philosophy and began the slow process of ideological transformation. But the impact persists. In the generation of Japanese who rebuilt their nation after the war, who created the economic miracle and the democratic stability that followed, were thousands of former prisoners who had experienced something that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had seen democracy function not as chaos but as generosity, not as weakness but as strength. The library was small in the grand scope of the war, one room in one camp among hundreds. But small spaces can house large transformations. A seed germinates in darkness before breaking into light. A single book can alter a single mind, which alters a family, which alters a community, which, over decades, alters a nation. This is the power that totalitarian ideologies fear, the power of the individual mind, given information and freedom, to think and choose and change. It is why such regimes control education, censor books, and limit access to knowledge. They understand intuitively what democracies assert explicitly, that free people, given truth, will not choose tyranny. The library at Camp McCoy was a wager on this principle. It was a statement of faith disguised as policy. It said, even you, even now, even after everything, are capable of reason. Even you are worth educating. Even you can change. And in the quiet turning of pages, in the soft discussions among men who had been enemies, in the trembling question, "Are we allowed this?" and the silent answer that followed, the wager was won. The snow falls in Wisconsin still. The prairie stretches white and endless under winter skies. The camp is gone, the fences pulled down, the barracks demolished. Where prisoners once stood in formation, trees grow. Where a library once stood, offering warmth and words to men who had expected only punishment, there is only grass and memory. But memory is not nothing. It is the foundation upon which the future is built. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we were and who we might become. It is the record that insists, this happened. This unlikely, impractical, idealistic thing happened. Men gave other men books. In the middle of war, in the depths of hatred, libraries were built and stocked and opened. Not because it was easy. Not because it was expected. Not because tradition demanded it or military efficiency required it. Because democracy insisted that even in war, even with enemies, some principles remain operative. That knowledge is better than ignorance, that humanity persists even in inhumanity's depths, that the same hands that build bombs can also build libraries, and that sometimes, in the space between chapters, in the silence between verses, in the warmth of a heated room filled with books, the future is quietly written by those willing to imagine that enemies might, one day, cease to be enemies and become simply people again. People who read, who think, who tremble before unexpected kindness and ask, voices breaking with wonder, are we allowed this? The answer, then and now, is yes. Always yes.